All right. Good morning, boys and girls. So today I'm going to share with you the dreadful, smelly colonies, the disgusting details about life in a colonial America. And it's by Elizabeth Raum. And studying the colonies, early American colonies, early North American colonies, is quite interesting and quite fun. And I love social history. And the wars and all that, yeah, I get it. But the social piece, the way the people interact, how they live their daily life has always been a fascination to me and helps me understand all the context for the other behaviors and politics that happened in those times. So I'd like you to share this book with me. Let's see what happens. Hopefully you'll know more about daily life in the colonies. So first of all, the 13 American colonies from 1607 to 1776. Okay, hopefully you can get a good image of that. Look at that little weird timeline thing they're doing. So if you have a report and they ask you for a timeline, this is a way you could do it. Let's see. So they have a legend. The orange is New England colonies, the middle colonies, the southern colonies are a pretty green, and present-day states are in brown. The cities have red dots, and a white spot is the colony, whatever that means. Okay, and then the populations, in 1587, 120 number of colonists. In the largest city, there wasn't one. 1617, 4,000 colonists, no big city. 1650, 50,400 people. Boston had 2,000 people in it. That was the biggest city. In 1650, we finally had a city. 1700s, 275,000 people, and Boston had 7,000 of them. In the 1720s, 475,000 people, and Boston had 12,000 of those people. In 1760s, 1,500,000 people. Philadelphia was now the biggest city. Oh dear, I grew up in Boston. Now I'm upset. Philadelphia had 1,900 people. Oh, sorry, 19,000 people. And then the 1770s, 2,210,000 people. Philadelphia had 28,000 people. Wow. All right, so let's see. And this just kind of goes through when things were established and how many people, right? So 1585, first English colony formed at Roanoke Island. It is deserted sometime before the 1600s. 1607, you'll learn about that on page 6, Jamestown and Sacagawea established. Sacagawea settlement fails. 1619 is on page 16. 20 Africans arrive at Jamestown on a Dutch ship to be sold as servants. And then in 1620 on page 9, about 100 colonists arrive at the Mayflower to form Plymouth colonies in Massachusetts. So there are many different occurrences that kind of move you through, and we're going to read about them on the pages, but if you get a hold of this book, you can read this in more detail. Let's see what happens, shall we? Foul fact. In 1610, 175 new settlers arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. They found only 60 of the first 500 colonists alive. Disease and starvation had killed the rest. When colonists arrived in America, they had to clear land and build shelters. New land, new home. In the 1600s, colonists came to America from Europe with the hopes of freedom and a new beginning. What they found instead was rough land, harsh weather, and dreadful living conditions. When colonists arrived in America, no warm, cozy homes were waiting for them, so they needed to find shelter fast. In the southern colonies, the first colonists lived in tents made of sailcloth. They complained bitterly of the bugs. Mosquitoes feasted on the new arrivals. Other colonists built small wigwams. They tied poles together and covered them with bark and tree branches to keep out the winter's cold. A fire added light, heat, and blinding smoke. In winters, families huddled on the straw floor beneath furs and blankets. Wigwam, a round house covered with tree bark. That does not sound enjoyable. I'll just give you a good image of that. The small shelters offered little protection from the harsh new land. Some settlers in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania dug cave-like homes. They lined dirt walls with sticks to prevent the home from collapsing. One wall contained a small door. Bugs skittered in through the tree branch roof and dropped onto sleepers. Mice, rats, and snakes slithered through the sod. Ew. The first wooden houses were only about 20 feet, 6 meters wide, by 20 feet, 60 meters long. Shutters over the windows kept out the wind, but they could also kept out the light. A fire burned constantly to provide light and heat. Everyone ate, worked, and slept in just one room. A lucky family might have a table and 1 or 2 chairs. Children stood while they ate their meals. They slept on the floor on mattresses stuffed with rags, corn husks, or bits of leftover wool. Households smelled of smoke, stew, and sweaty bodies. Disease and death. March 24th, 1621, Plymouth Colony. This month, 13 of our number died. During the last 3 months, half of those in our colony have perished. Most died from lack of housing. Some suffered from disease like scurvy brought on by the long ocean voyage. Of 100 persons, scarcely 50 remain. The living are barely able to bury the dead. There is no one to care for the ill. But spring is coming, and we hope that the deaths will cease and that the sick and lame will recover. All have shown great patience during this time of suffering. Above quotation is based on the writing of Thomas Prince, as published in the Annals of New England, 1726. So this is what was documented. Can you imagine? This sounds really, really harsh. What are you learning about the colony so far? Hardtack. Anyone? Picky eaters didn't last long in the colonies. At first, colonists ate what they brought with them on the ship. They ate dried peas that had to be soaked in water for hours and then boiled. For meat, they had salted pork or beef. When meat became moldy and rotten, colonists scraped away the mold and ate what was left. Their only bread was hardtack, a rock-hard cracker made of flour and water. Beetles, called weevils, burrowed into the hardtack, which made it easier to eat. Ugh. After these supplies ran out, most colonists suffered through a starving time. Some settlers survived on corn that they bought from the American Indians. Others tried fishing. The forests were full of wildlife, but most colonists didn't own guns, so they ate whatever they could gather or kill. One Jamestown colonist reported eating dogs, cats, rats, snakes, toadstools, horsehides, and whatnot. He was lucky. Many others starved. In time, colonists learned to grow corn, but corn made for a boring diet. In many homes, colonists ate cornmeal mush or porridge for both breakfast and supper. The biggest meal was often a stew of beans, corn, and other vegetables. On a good day, the stew might include raccoon or deer meat. Yum! When crops were good, colonists had plenty of food to eat. Hardtack. So here is a picture of hardtack. And there they are with their harvest. It sounds pretty hard going. No privacy in the privy. Imagine the nice, comfy bathroom you use every day. Now, picture a rough tree, dirty pit, or smelly outhouse. Pretty gross, right? But that's what the colonists used for bathrooms. At first, colonists stepped behind a tree or a bush when they needed to go. But as towns grew and people lived closer together, they needed another solution. Colonists dug pits downhill from their homes and built outhouses or privies over the pit. A board with a hole in the middle formed the seat. Waste fell into the pit. When the pit was full, colonists dug a new pit and moved the outhouse. People who were very old or sick used a chamber pot. This pottery bowl was dumped outside each morning. Children often did this job. In cities, chamber pots were emptied into the street, sometimes landing on people passing by. Animals added to the problem too. Pigs, cows, and horses wandered freely through towns, leaving their droppings behind. If colonists didn't watch their step, they carried the stinky mess inside on their shoes. Foul fact, There was no toilet paper in colonial America. Colonists used corn cobs to clean themselves. They tossed them in the pit after use. Most colonial outhouses were small wooden shacks with no windows. Doesn't that sound comfy and fun? Ew. Dirty jobs. How would you like to bend over 6,000 times a day planting tiny seeds? Sound like fun? Maybe not you, but that's how colonists planted their crops. But before colonists could plant seeds, they had to clear dense forests to make farm fields. Men swung heavy axes to cut down massive trees. Once the huge tree fell, they had to be cut apart and moved. There were no sawmills, so men chopped logs and firewood by hand. Once the trees were gone, the dirty field work continued. Men, women, and children used hoes and shovels to break up the hard soil. The dirty job got a little easier when plows were invented in the 1670s. After the fields were plowed, it was time to plant. But that just meant more long hours digging in the dirt. American Indians taught colonists how to plant corn in small hills. Men and women planted corn crops by hand. They used a small stick or their fingers to make holes in the dirt for corn seeds. Colonial children worked alongside their parents, harvesting crops. That sounds like hard work, but it also sounds like you know what you're going to get out of it at the end. Hard labor. Colonial farms needed workers, as did businesses such as lumber and shipbuilding. Indentured servants and slaves did much of the work. Indentured servants signed contracts promising to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for a free trip to America. In 1619, the first African slaves arrived at Jamestown. At first, a few were able to buy their freedom. Later, the laws changed, making them slaves permanently. Slaves were considered the owner's property. Trying to escape meant death. Many slaves were beaten, whipped, and worked to death on the farms of colonial America. Indentured servants and slaves got up at dawn and worked until bedtime. Female servants hauled water, cooked meals, cared for children, and helped in the fields. Male servants cleared land, tended crops, and whatever else their masters required. Indentured servant, someone who agrees to work for another person for a certain length of time in exchange for travel. Young slave. When I was 9, I was first forced to work even harder. In summer, I pounded 4 bushels of ears of corn every night in a barrel for the chickens. In winter, I had to card wool until a very late hour. If I failed at these tasks, I would be harshly punished. Slave boy in Massachusetts, 1740s. Colonial slave auction. This is not a good part of our history. Rough roads. Getting around the colonies was a chore. The best way to travel was by boat, provided your craft didn't topple over in the churning waters. Most colonists traveled by foot, following old Indian trails through the woods. Trees and bushes barred the way. Travelers jumped or waded across narrow streams. They crossed deep rivers and streams in boats or canoes. Most people couldn't swim. Carriages and carts were rare. In 1697, Philadelphia had only 30 wheeled vehicles in the entire city. Small, cramped carriages bounced along through dirt roads. Wheels fell off. Horses got tired. A carriage trip was slow, dusty, and uncomfortable. Long trips took several days. In remote areas, travelers slept outdoors or stayed with farm families. In towns, they stopped at taverns. The tavern owner provided food and drink and a shared bed for a price. Foul fact. In taverns, travelers shared not only a room, but also a bed. In some taverns, 6 men shared one bed. They slept head to toe. Yuck. Could you imagine sharing a bed with your fellow stranger? Yuck. In the colonies, people traveled along rough roads to buy or trade goods. So here are some images for you just to fill up your head. Women were Witch trials. Some colonists blamed witches for bad weather, ill health, dead animals, or failed crops. Women, more often than men, were labeled witches and put on trial. If a woman was found guilty of being a witch, her punishment was often death. Connecticut held more witch trials than any other colony. The most famous trials occurred in Salem, Massachusetts. In 1692, several young girls accused dozens of town people of witchcraft. The accused were jailed for months. 19 of them were eventually put to death. One 80-year-old man refused to admit his guilt at trial. He died when heavy stones were piled on top of his body. By 1700, the witch trials ended. Women were tried and convicted as witches, even though little evidence was presented against them. And hangman's noose. Basically, to prove you weren't a witch, you had to die. Because if you're a witch, you wouldn't die by, being pushed into water until you couldn't breathe. So either way, you were dead. And often the researchers have found people accused of being witches is often over some kind of dispute or jealousy. Bad medicine. Almost from the time they landed in America, colonists battled new and deadly diseases. Smallpox, diphtheria, and yellow fever killed thousands. Smallpox attacked American Indians and colonists alike. After 3 or 4 days of fever, blisters broke out all over the body. Skin fell away, and the victim died in terrible pain. Diphtheria was a deadly lung disease. Yellow fever, spread by mosquitoes, caused high fever and death. Doctors tried bleeding patients to cure these and other illnesses. A doctor made tiny cuts in the patient's arm until the blood ran freely. Doctors also gave foul-tasting medicines that caused vomiting or diarrhea. Doctors believed that blood, vomit, and diarrhea carried illnesses away. For fever, colonial doctors cut fish called herrings down the back and tied them to their patients' feet. Other doctors gave patients a broth made of boiled toads. People believed that the stronger the smell, the better the medicine. Smallpox, a disease that spreads easily, causing chills, fevers, and pimples that scar. Uncommon cures. The women are pitifully tooth-shaken, whether through the coldness of the climate or by the sweetmeats, sugar, I am not sure. For toothache, I have found the following medicine very available. Add butter to gunpowder and rub the jaw with it. For frozen limbs, make a lotion of soap, salt, and molasses, or use cow dung boiled in milk. John Jocelyn, 1674. Yuck! Colonial doctors gathering plants. Cow dung, herring, gunpowder. The cures they come up with are quite fascinating and disturbing. What's that smell? It wasn't just the medicines that smelled bad. Colonial people did too. They seldom bathed. Most people believed water was unhealthy. They thought the dirt and sweat caked into their skin protected them from illness. After finally taking a bath, one colonial woman said, "I bore it rather well, not having been wet all over for 28 years. Most colonists had dirty hands, muddy feet, and greasy hair. Lice and nits crawled through colonists' hair and jumped from one person to another. Some colonists used fine combs to remove the nits. Others dusted their hair with powder. Most colonists just scratched. Even so, people took great care to clean their clothes. Most only had 2 or 3 outfits, so keeping them clean wasn't easy. Women hauled water, heated it, and then scrubbed clothes by hand. During the winter, laundry piled up for weeks because the water froze. Most people were forced to wear dirty clothes covered with food splatters, animal droppings, and grime. Colonists used hard soap and a washboard to do laundry. Colonial water bucket. So can you imagine walking around in grime? All that dirt and goo on your body they thought protected them? And we spend so much time scrubbing every little thing. Difficult times. Thanks to the help of American Indian tribes, hardy colonists survived their first years in America. Indians taught colonists such useful skills as turning animal furs into clothing and carving dugout canoes. Even so, disputes arose over land and hunting grounds. When several Virginia tribes killed 347 colonists in 1622, colonists built forts and gathered weapons to protect themselves. American Indians attacked small groups of settlers using surprise as a weapon. Colonial leaders sought revenge without bothering to find out which tribe had attacked them or why. They struck out at the nearest village. Colonists used guns to kill the people and then destroyed their homes and crops. In Massachusetts, colonists wiped out entire American Indian villages during the Pequot War of 1637. A few years later, in King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, American Indians burned colonial villages to the ground. Women and children were taken captive. Men were killed. Disputes over land caused conflicts between colonists and American Indians. Times change, smells remain. Colonial life changed greatly in the years following the founding of Jamestown. Houses became larger, many were built of brick. Brick houses didn't burn as easily as wood, and they lasted longer. Gardens flourished, and food was plentiful. People still worked hard, but it was easier to find food and shelter. By the mid-1700s, there were stores, libraries, and mail service throughout the 13 colonies. Children attended schools, stagecoaches carried people from place to place on well-worn roads, newspapers provided current information, but the colonies still smelled bad. People dumped their garbage in pits outside or burned it. Cows grazed on Boston Common. Pigs ran through the streets of New York City. Horses, cows, sheep, and chickens shared the streets with pigs and people. Houses smelled of smoke and cooking odors. Even the fanciest homes did not have running water or indoor plumbing. Everyone used privies or outhouses, and most people still did not bathe. Despite some smelly problems, the colonies were developing into a new country. In 1776, the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. They would soon become the United States of America. Farm animals often roamed the streets of colonial towns. And then there's a really cool glossary. And then here's some more references and internet sites. FactHound offers a safe, fun way to find internet sites related to this book. All of the sites on FactHound have been researched by our staff. Here's all you do. Visit www.facthound. FactHound will fetch the best sites for you. So I don't know if that still exists since this book was written, but it sounds like it's been verified for children. So if you're curious, you definitely could pursue some more of that. I hope you enjoyed a little bit about learning about the colony's daily life. I know a lot of facts and dates were thrown at you, but there are plenty of other resources you can read to think about those dates and times and get even more. But at least this scratches the surface. And now you know about the bathing habits of the colonists. Until the next story, bye.